The most expensive fishing lure ever sold looked, to the first person who held it, like a piece of scrap plumbing. Hollow copper, hand-hammered into a rough fish shape, no brand stamped anywhere on it. The kind of thing you would drop into a coffee can with the bent hooks and the dried-out line and never think about again. That lump of copper sold at auction for $101,200. Not a typo, 6 figures. More than a fully rigged bass boat, for something most people would have set out at a yard sale with a $1 sticker on it. And here is the part that should stop you. It is not the exception, it is the rule. The fishing lures worth real money right now were built, almost without exception, to look exactly like the ones people throw away. I have spent a long time on the buying side of a counter, the side where someone slides a box across the glass and waits to hear what it is worth. And the same scene plays out over and over. Somebody walks in holding a fortune and calls it junk. Somebody else walks in holding junk and swears it is a fortune. The only thing standing between those two people is whether they can read what is actually in their hands. By the time we are done, you will read an old lure the way the buyer across that counter reads it. The eyes, the hardware, the paint, the box. You will know which 15 are worth a second look before you ever let one go, and you will understand why almost nobody ever told you. Walk into any tackle shop today, and every square foot of it is pointed at one thing. Next season. The new finish, the new action, the lure that did not exist 18 months ago and will not be on the peg in 18 more. There is no shelf for the other kind of knowledge. No display rack that says, the dented wooden minnow in your grandfather's box might be worth a year of someone's salary. There is no product in that sentence. Nothing to ring up. You cannot patent the fact that a company went out of business in 1931, and you cannot reorder rarity from a catalog. So the industry simply never had a reason to teach it to you. That is not a conspiracy. It is just the shape of the business. The knowledge sits with the people who buy and sell these things, the collectors, the auction houses, the dealers, and the gap between what they know and what the average seller knows is exactly where the money changes hands. The good news is the gap is made of information, and information you can close in an afternoon. So let's close it. Let's count down 15 old lures that keep getting sold for nothing, and the signal each one is trying to show you, if you know where to look. Number 15. The Hosmer Mechanical Frog. Made around 1936 near Dearborn, Michigan. Bright yellow, hand-painted spots, with a mechanism inside that actually worked the legs, a genuine oddity for its day, and very few survived. But here is what I want you to notice, because it is the whole lesson of this one. When a Hosmer frog turns up in excellent shape, with its original paper-labeled box and the instruction sheet still inside, it does not just hold its value, it climbs. One example with all of it intact has brought well over $13,000 at auction. Think of a baseball card. Now think of that same card, never opened, still sealed in its original wax wrapper. Same cardboard, completely different number. A lure works the same way. The lure is the card. The box is the wrapper. Number 14. The Hardy Interchangeable Casting Minnow, patented in 1904 and built by the Artificial Bait Company in Monticello, Indiana. The lure itself is rare, but the one that crossed the block for just over $15,000 did not come alone. It came with its original box and its original paperwork. So write this down before we go any further. The paper that came with the lure is not packaging, it is evidence. It tells an expert when the lure was made, who made it, and that it is the real thing. The cardboard you have been throwing away your whole life is, very often, worth more than the lure it held, and almost everybody throws it away. Which is exactly why the next signal is hiding in plain sight. Number 13. The Shakespeare Revolution. Built in 1897. A small jointed wooden plug, under 4 inches, 3 treble hooks, a metal propeller at the nose, to push water and trigger a strike. It looks unremarkable. It is anything but. This was the first wooden bait Shakespeare ever produced, and the first is a phrase that moves collectors the way it moves anyone. First run, first year, first of its kind. A clean early example sits around $15,000. Number 12. The early Shakespeare musky minnow. Big, heavy, built for the largest predators in freshwater, and it came in a wooden box with a sliding top. Now, wooden boxes do not survive. They get used for kindling, they rot in a damp garage, they get tossed. Fewer than a dozen of those slide-top boxes are believed to still exist anywhere. So when one surfaces looking like it never touched the water, the box does as much work as the lure. One brought right around $17,600. Notice the pattern forming. Big musky baits, early companies, the original box. None of that is about how pretty the lure is. It is about how few are left, and that question, how few are left, is the one that quietly runs this entire market. Which brings us to the companies that stopped making things altogether. Number 11. The Little Wonder Minnow, from the Clinton Wilt Manufacturing Company in Springfield, Missouri, patented around 1913. A slim wooden body, a barber pole paint scheme, spinners at both ends turning against each other, a regional bait from a company most anglers have never heard of, and that, the fact that you have never heard of them, is the point. Clinton Wilt did not sell millions for 50 years. They made a relatively small number of these, and then they were gone. When one of their little wonders turns up complete with its two-piece cardboard box, it has sold for well over $18,000. Here is a rule that runs against every instinct. With antique lures, the brand everybody recognizes is usually the cheap one. Rarity does not come from the company that sold the most. It comes from the company that stopped. Number 10. The Wiggletail, patented in 1905 by Charles Smith of LaGrange, Indiana. It had a strange tail mechanism that gave it a swimming action. Early American tinkering at its finest. It is believed there are only about a dozen of these left in the world. Scarcity like that does not ask for permission. A clean example has crossed $17,500 at auction, so a name you do not recognize is not a reason to price something at $1. Sometimes it is the only reason it is worth thousands. The next signal, though, is one most people destroy with their own hands, before they ever find out what they had. Now stop. Before we go one lure further, this is the single most expensive mistake people make, and it takes about 30 seconds to make it for good. You pull a muddy, tarnished old lure out of a box, and every instinct says, clean it up. Get a toothbrush. Get some polish. Make it presentable. Don't. The grime, the faded paint, the dull haze on an old lure, that is not dirt. It is the proof of age. It is the thing an expert needs to trust, that what they are looking at is real and old and original. Scrub an antique wooden lure, and you dissolve the old oil-based paint and varnish that can never be put back. Buff the metal on an early bait, and you strip the surface that took a century to form. Collectors have a word for a lure that has been over-polished. They call it whizzed, and a whizzed lure, shined up and scrubbed down, can lose almost all of its value in the time it takes to wipe it clean. There is a second one that catches people in storage. Leave a soft plastic worm pressed against an old painted lure in a warm tackle box, and the chemicals in the plastic melt a scar straight into the paint. Collectors call it worm burn. It is permanent. Keep your soft plastics away from anything old. And if you want to know how the experts catch a fake, the people repainting cheap lures in rare colors to fool a buyer, here is their quietest tool. A simple ultraviolet light. Think of a tan line showing up under a black light. Things that are invisible in daylight suddenly glowing. Modern paints do exactly that. They are full of synthetic brighteners that light up. The old paints, the ones used before the Second World War, have none of that. Under ultraviolet, they stay flat and dark. So if someone hands you a lure they swear is from the 1920s and it glows like a road sign, you are holding a fake. The National Fishing Lure Collectors Club and the writers who have spent careers on this, people like Jeff Morrison, will tell you the same thing. The light does not lie, and neither does the grime. Leave it alone until you know. Which matters even more with the next two, because their value is hiding in details you cannot put back once they are gone. Number 9. The Heddon Mohawk Minnow, from around 1905, tied to a short-lived Heddon operation in Mohawk, Florida. It is believed to be the only known example that still carries its matching wooden box and the original paper instructions inside. Untouched, complete, and that bundle has brought over $18,000. It is also the perfect lure to teach you two signals a buyer reads in seconds, both sitting right on the lure. First, the eyes. Picture the date stamped into the sidewall of a car tire, small, easy to miss, and it tells you exactly what era you are in. The eyes do the same thing. Up until the late 1930s, the best lures used glass eyes, the same kind used in taxidermy, many of them imported from Germany. Deep, clear glass eyes almost always mean before the Second World War. When the war cut the glass supply off, makers switched to painted eyes and little metal tacks. One look at the eye, and you have pinned the decade. Second, the rigging, how the hooks hang on the body. The earliest Heddon minnows bolted each hook on with a tiny metal cup, what collectors call a cup rig. Later, to cut cost, the industry moved to plain screw eyes, so a 5-hook Heddon Dowagiac minnow from before about 1920, wearing glass eyes and cup hardware at every hook, is a lure a buyer will pay several hundred to well over $1,000 for, while the seller is pricing it at $20 because it just says Heddon, and they assume they know what that means. Number 8 makes the same point with a different name. The high-forehead Shakespeare minnow from 1907. Odd body, see-through hardware, and if you are very lucky, its rare maroon picture box. A clean one with the correct box has sold for $18,700. Complex hardware means old. Old means rare. But none of it, not the eyes, not the rigging, not the box, matters as much as the one signal most sellers get exactly backwards. The color. Number 7. The Heddon Black Sucker. Close to 6 inches of wood, big glass eyes, a front spinner, an intact wooden tail. A beautiful lure, but that is not what makes this one elite. It is the finish. This one wears a rare natural scale pattern, and with its matching box, it has sold for around $19,000. Here is the logic, and it runs backwards from what you would expect. The common colors sold well. They sold well because the company made a lot of them, which means a lot of them still exist, which means they are cheap. The strange colors, the ones that did not sell, got made in small numbers and then dropped. Those are the ones collectors empty their accounts for. Think of a misprinted coin. The mistake, the thing the mint did not want, is exactly what makes it valuable, because there are so few. Rare finishes work the same way. Common is common. Odd is money. Number 6 takes that to its limit. The Musky Charmer Minnow from the Charmer Minnow Company. A slim wooden musky bait, just over 5 inches, already one of the rarest baits that company made. But this one example carries something no other is known to have. A hand-painted striped tail. One single detail, on one single lure, with no known twin. When something is truly one of one, the price stops following a chart and starts following whoever wants it most, and for a lure like this, that has meant well into the tens of thousands. So before you ever price an old lure, you have to be able to read all of this. The shape, the box, the eyes, the rigging, the color. That is a lot to hold in your head standing in a dusty garage with a flashlight. So I made you something. Everything we have covered, the order of the signals, the list of what to check before you clean or sell anything, the real auction names so you can verify every number yourself, I have put it all on a single page. One sheet you can fold into your wallet or tape inside the lid of a tackle box. Point your phone at the code on the screen and it is yours. No charge, nothing to sign up for. Then stay with me, because the last 5 lures on this list are the ones people have most often held in their own hands and let go of for nothing. And number 1 is the one that started all of this. Number 5. The Heddon Frog. Before James Heddon ran the most famous lure company in America, he was a beekeeper. By the 1880s, one of the largest honey producers in the country. And around 1897, before he was selling lures at all, he hand-carved little wooden frogs, a hook on each leg, a treble hook hanging from the belly, 2 black eyes, and handed them out to his honey distributors as a thank you for their business. He did not found his lure company until 1902. By most counts, only 8 or 9 of those original hand-carved frogs still exist anywhere on Earth. Each one sells for around $30,000, and every one of them looks like exactly what it is. A crude wooden frog, whittled by hand. To an untrained eye, it is a craft project. To a collector, it is one of the rarest objects in the sport. Number 4 is the one historians argue over. a wooden minnow found in the tackle box of an angler named Hiram Rice in the Twin Lakes country of Ohio, dating to right around the turn of the century. No one has ever pinned down for certain who made it, but it sits so close to the earliest known American wooden minnows that it has been called the missing link, the bait the others descend from. Even without a maker's name on it, that significance set off a bidding war. It sold for about $42,500. No brand, no stamp, no clean paint, and one of the most important fishing lures ever to cross an auction block. The pattern is almost complete now. The less a lure looks like something valuable, the harder you should look. Which brings us to the top three, where the oldest stories in the sport are hiding. Two of them predate the entire American tackle industry, and one of them failed so badly at catching fish that the failure is the only reason it is worth a fortune today. Number 3. The Haskell Muskie Minnow. The same Riley Haskell, a gunsmith, not a tackle man, who built that lump of copper from the opening. He also built bigger versions for the largest fish in freshwater. This one runs about 7.5 inches of hollow copper, with scales and fins stamped in one at a time, by hand, in 1859. That is not a manufacturing process. That is a craftsman with a metalworking bench and no factory anywhere in the country to compete with him. One of these sold at auction for over $32,000. Number 2 is the strangest story in this entire countdown. The Chautauqua Minnow, made by Krantz and Smith of New York around 1908. It was advertised as America's first weedless lure. A clever design, complex little springs inside, a genuinely pretty thing. It had exactly one problem. It was terrible at catching fish. So anglers did not buy it. Production stopped almost immediately. And that, the commercial flop, the thing that should have killed it forever, is precisely what makes it priceless now. Because almost none were ever made. The lure that could not catch a fish to save its life became one of the most sought-after collectibles in the sport. Years ago, before the all-time record was set, one Chautauqua sold online for nearly $46,000. Sit with that. The best lure in the room is worth a few dollars because they made 1 million of them. The lure that failed is worth a fortune because they barely made any. That single idea, more than any other, is the thing the people inside this market understand, and the people outside it never get told. Which leaves number 1, the lump of copper from the very beginning. It is time to tell you the whole story. Number 1. The giant Haskell Minnow. The lure from the first frame, the hollow copper fish that looks like plumbing scrap. Riley Haskell patented his minnow in 1859 in Painesville, Ohio. To put that in perspective, that is decades before James Heddon carved his first frog. Decades before there was a tackle industry in this country at all. Haskell was not competing with anyone. There was no one to compete with. He hammered these out of copper and brass the way he engraved his guns. Every scale, every fin, by hand. Most Haskell minnows are small and already extremely rare. This one is different. It measures 10 inches, nearly double any other known example, and it is believed to be one of a kind. In 2003, it sold through Lang's, the auction house collectors treat as the Sotheby's of fishing tackle, for $101,200. The highest price ever paid for a fishing lure, and it has held that record for over 20 years. Now picture where a thing like that hides: an estate sale, a cigar box of fishing odds and ends on a folding table, this crude metal shape sitting in there with rusted hooks and a tangle of old line, a $2 sticker on the box. Somebody picks it up, turns it over, sees no brand, and sets it back down. That is the whole point of this list. The most valuable lures in the world do not look valuable. They look handmade. Because they were, before machines made everything else. That is not a flaw to clean off, or a reason to price it down. That is the signal. That is the fortune, sitting in plain sight, waiting on the one person who knows how to read it. Go back to that counter from the beginning. The glass top, the box sliding across it, the half-second where someone waits to find out what they have. Nothing about the lure in that box changed in the last 20 minutes. Same copper, same wood, same faded paint, same little glass eyes. What changed is you. You can now read the things the price tag never showed. The shape that means it came before the machines, the eyes that pin the decade, the cup rig, the rare color that did not sell, the box that is worth more than the bait, and the one rule that protects all of it. Don't clean it, and don't sell it blind. None of that was ever printed on a package, because the package had no reason to print it. There is no money in teaching you what you already own. The market runs on the gap, and you just closed it. So the next time you stand over an old tackle box, in a garage, at an estate sale, in your own attic, you will not be guessing anymore. You will be reading. The same box 100 people walked past, and you will be the one who can tell what is actually in it. And it only takes one lure to change the math. If you would rather look at the water knowing what the tackle wall will never tell you, you already know which side of that counter you belong on. Subscribe, and we will keep pulling the rest of it back into the light. One lure at a time.